Hi and welcome to our tutorial to make the oven gloves using our crafty Sew&So pattern. You are going to need your fabric, your wadding and your bias binding to make this project. And we're going to start by layering up our fabrics to quilt the layers together before we cut them out. So I've got my two strips of fabric which I've cut, so these are a little bit wider than the finished cut pattern piece, and I'm going to sandwich two layers of heat-proof wadding in between the two layers of my cotton fabric. We're using two layers of the heat-proof wadding as per the manufacturer's instructions to make sure that these are safe to use with dishes straight from the oven. And we're using 100% cotton fabric, as this is both fire retardant and not going to melt if you do touch something straight from the oven and keep that's really hot. Once we've layered our fabrics together, we're going to make sure that we've got the right sides facing out at the top and the bottom, and then the two layers of wadding nicely sandwiched in between. And you're just going to want to pin all those layers together so that you can then take that to the sewing machine in a moment and do a quilting design to keep those fabrics all together and choose a decorative design for your finished project. Once that's all pinned together, we're going to draw on the lines for the quilting. So I'm using a quilting ruler and a friction pen, but you can choose any marking tool of your choice. You can also choose to use a regular 30cm long ruler instead of a quilting ruler if you don't have one. A ruler of any kind will do the job very nicely. I'm choosing to draw lines at an angle around 2 inches apart, but you are absolutely welcome to do any kind of quilt design that you fancy on this project. It doesn't make a difference to the final function of the project, but it does give you the opportunity to have a bit of a play with your quilting techniques. You can use straight lines like I'm doing here. You could do a grid pattern with lines going at the other direction as well, or you could have a go at free motion quilting if you would like to try that. Just bear in mind that you need to keep the quilting lines fairly close together to keep all the layers together and functioning well. Once that's ready, we're just going to take that over to the sewing machine and quilt over those lines that you've drawn. If you're doing straight lines, you're going to want your needle to be in the centre position, and then you're just going to take your time following those lines really carefully using a slightly elongated stitch of around 3.5 mm. Repeat through all the lines that you've drawn on until your whole mitt is quilted. Once you've got all your layers quilted together, now we're going to cut out the template from our quilted layers. So we do this at this stage so that any changes to the fabric as we sew it together aren't affected by the size of the finished oven glove. So lining up all your layers, making sure that they are overlapping in all the right places. You can then fold the fabric in half and lay the oven glove template on top. Now you can pin or you can draw around this to cut it out, or you can of course use pattern weights. I'm going to pin all my layers together and then I'm going to cut out my fabric with all those layers. This works because I've got very sharp fabric scissors. If your fabric scissors struggle with all the layers, open it up, trace round the pattern piece on both sides with the match in the middle at the fold, and then cut out with your scissors on the single layer of the quilted fabric. Prepare the fabric and the quilting layers for the covers of the oven gloves as well, and now you're ready to cut out the other side of the oven gloves which holds your hands to the glove, and in the same way cut it out, ready to go through all those layers that you've prepared earlier. If you find that your oven glove layers aren't exactly the same size or width after you've cut them out, just trim them down so they match up, because it's really important that they do line up when we are attaching the bias binding and assembling the whole mitt later on. Now we're going to attach the bias binding to this straight edge of the oven mitt, and we're going to do that by pressing open the folded edge of the bias binding and pinning along that creased edge, so that attaching the bias binding to the edge of the oven mitt. Once you've sewn down the first layer of the bias binding to the top edge of the oven mitt, you're going to fold over the bias binding so it encases that raw edge, and then you can pin or you can use the wander clips to hold the bias binding over that raw edge so you can sew it down in place. Beginner, I'd recommend you use a zigzag stitch to attach the bias binding over the edge of the oven mitt. A zigzag stitch will be very forgiving and will hold everything in place without the need to be incredibly delicate and accurate, and it gives quite a nice decorative finish. However, if you are in the mood for a bit more of a challenge, you can use the stitch in the ditch method instead. To do the stitch in the ditch method, you're going to be sewing on the wrong side of the fabric, and sewing just between where the fabric, the bias binding is attached to the oven mitt. With this technique you have to be ever so careful that the bias binding on the bottom side is covering all the way over and is definitely in place, so you might want to use more clips or more pins for this. And then when you're sewing on the other side, you're sewing it down blind, and so you have to be careful that you're definitely catching the bottom layers of bias binding. This is a tricky technique, and it gives a really beautiful finish, but it's definitely one worth practicing. Once you've got both sides ready, we're going to pin those covers over the edge of the main oven glove. Again, you might find that you need to just trim that down a little bit if there's some overlap, so that everything lines up nicely. Once you've pinned those in place, we're going to take them to the sewing machine and sew them down so that they are secure and we know they're not going to be moved when we're doing the bias binding. To get the bias binding ready, we're going to start in the same way as we did the shorter edges of the oven mitts. We're going to open up the folded edge and pin in place all the way around the outside of the glove. You're going to want to follow the fold line of the bias binding and pin along it. This will give you a small ½ centimetre or 1/4 inch seam allowance, and so you're really going to want to take your time to be accurate with this. When we get back round to the beginning, we're going to make sure that there's enough excess bias binding that we can have a nice decent overlap of at least 2 inches. Then we're going to trim off the excess bias binding and put that aside for later. Before you pin the bias binding down at this point, we're going to join the 2 ends of bias binding on the sewing machine. So find the point where they match up as close as possible, And we're going to take that over to the sewing machine to sew that seam together now. You should just use a nice straight stitch to sew those two ends of bias binding together exactly where you pinned it together. The bias binding to the edge of the oven mitt all the way around using a 1/2 centimetre seam allowance. Trim down any excess fabric that's come away from where the two layers line up, and also reduce the bulk at any particularly bulky areas, especially around the two mitts. Then we're going to press and fold the bias binding to cover those raw edges. You can see where it's gotten a bit difficult, so we're going to fold it over because of the bulk of the fabric, so that's why we're going to trim it down a bit more. And then we're going to pin or clip the bias binding over those raw edges before we sew it down again. Before we finish by sewing down the bias binding, you might want to take a loop of either bias binding or ribbon and insert it into the bias binding that you're attaching to the oven mitt around the halfway point on one of the long sides to create a hanging loop for your oven mitts in your kitchen. Clip the loop underneath the bias binding at the midpoint, and then you'll sew that in place as you go round the rest of the mitt. Using the same stitch you chose for when you were attaching the bias binding to the end mitts, now attach the bias binding and finish the bias binding off all the way around the oven glove, starting and stopping along one of the long straight edges. Take your time and be careful around the curves, as the bias binding will have curved around them, but it can pucker if you are too hasty. You're finished, you'll have a fantastic pair of oven gloves ready for cooking up a storm next time you're in the kitchen. Thanks for watching my tutorial. Goodbye.